There are three levels of themes in this movie that I am not seeing anybody else talking about. So we're going to get into it. These are topics that interest me, which is the medieval mindset, Rudolf Steiner, and let's say the Findhorn interaction with fairies. Maybe there's some psychology and symbolism, which is what fairy tales are all about. And a lot of this show, a lot of this movie, although it's like a horror, grim, fairy tale with these very simple, symbolic characters, there's a lot more that seems to be going on, and it may or may not be intentional on the part of the director. But let's just take the story. Here's what's going through my mind, and let's just see. Sometimes when you cook with good, or interesting ingredients, you end up putting something really interesting together. And I think this story actually does that. And some of it might be kind of surprising. I scrounged, looking through YouTube and found a lot of articles that did not get into any of the things that I want to talk about, what really interested me about this movie. So it's not really a very, it didn't really, get me in terms of like a horror thing. Like there's moments where I wished it had gone on longer, it had gone into more depth with things. But I can understand kind of where it's going if you approach it from the level of a fairy tale and how fairy tales work, in the sense that a story is an exploration of psychic space. Not just a random collection of like interesting things that happen, but it's something that you read or explore. It's what mythology is. You read or explore, enter into to map the meaning of your interior life and what's going on in you. From that standpoint, this movie has some really interesting things to go over. So like I said, let's get into a couple of the notes that I wrote down after this. Tell me what you think, see if they're interesting. I love talking about movies and thinking inordinately deeply about stuff, and maybe it's helpful, maybe it's not. I'll leave it to you to decide, but this is stuff that goes through my mind. So let's get into some of the symbolism that's in this that I think is really interesting. Okay, number one thing is the parrot. So we're going to go over the parrot, the forest, and the sense maybe of quarantine or like a caged garden or a walled garden or a cage. So one, she has a caged bird, which is a traditional symbol of the soul. This goes all the way back to ancient Egypt, where the Ba was one of the levels of your soul that left when you die. It's routinely venerated. Angels are presented as birds, or birds are symbolic of angels. And usually when you see like a bird or anything winged in a myth or in a fairy tale, pay attention. That means angels are afoot, fairies are involved. Something of a higher spiritual level is involved. And so it actually then means something, that these watcher creatures have actually lost their wings. They have lost a higher level of their spiritual natures. We'll come back to this in a little bit, this idea of the hierarchy of being, the great chain of being that was so vivid and present to the medievals that we've lost today. Okay, so her character, her name is Mina. If you haven't yet watched the trailer, go ahead and watch it. I'm going to leave this in the background because it's cool and moody. If you haven't yet seen it, or the movie or the book, probably some spoilers in here. Now, I have not read the book, so I'm just going off of one watching of the movie and the stuff that really jumped to my mind. So she is awfully traumatized. Spoiler alert, click away if you need to. She was in a horrible accident as a child. She is one of a pair of, she's a twin, and she lost her mother. And since then, let me run with the symbolism, see where it goes. She is carrying her soul in a cage. Okay, that's what trauma can do, is it cages you off. It separates you from actually being able to be in a lived experience, to be present, right? You're locked away from everything. So until she lets it free, and then she lets her soul free, right? And then it is able to guide her out of the hell that she wasn't paying attention to, which is very much her life. I think it's really obvious because her dress is yellow the moment of the crash. And then the parrot is the only thing that is yellow. Like the symbolism seems too on the nose to ignore that it's meant to be her. But then it's also interesting to me is that she names it Darwin. And this is a fun thing. This is where so many modern horror movies, at least the few that I have seen, they are horror largely because it's a materialist, atheist, mindset, re-engaging with overwhelming spiritual realities that you are not prepared for. And that's pretty horrific stuff because you have no idea how to respond to it. So it seems pretty interesting that she, after this trauma, she either has named the parrot Darwin or its name is Darwin. And for most people who throw that name around, this is my sense of it, it's a catch-all name for a non-spiritual view of how the world works, which it would be basically evolution as opposed to spiritual evolution. We're thinking here of Rudolf Steiner or Teilhard de Chardin. Instead, we're thinking of a non-spiritual, non-sacred sense of sacred evolution. We're talking about a random struggle to fit into a meaningless dead matter environment. So if that's her worldview, which it is for a lot of us today, it makes sense that this would cage up her soul's ability to be aware of the world and to know what to do. Now, the reason why I bring that up is because I am coming from the standpoint, or I think the story, not even me, the story is coming from the standpoint that we don't live in that kind of world where the Darwinian evolution is true. And in fact, that's pretty obvious just from watching the trailer. So it's a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek joke that this is the mindset that she brings with her into this situation until she realizes this is not true. And again, well, let's just keep going. So what strikes me as funny, so she's so unaware of the world and that she is driving through that she literally drives off road, right? She's supposed to be driving, I think it was to Belfast or something, to take this parrot to a zoo. I just remember thinking, like, this is a bit funny. She's not only driving through this deep forest, she's now off road. And then the car ends up stopping so deep in a forest that there is not even a road anymore. And I'm just thinking, how is it you didn't stop a hell of a lot earlier? Because it just seemed like ridiculous. I think it's all part of the story. It's part of the metaphor because she is spiritually blind. She ends up, it's a metaphor for being spiritually blind. You end up in a place where you don't know, where there are no roads. Forests and fairy tales are always an indication of entering a spiritual wilderness, a place where you can't see the horizon, you can't see the sun, you can't see these things that give orientation and order and direction to your life. Instead, a forest is like being out in the deep sea, like Noah in the ark. There is nothing. There's no way to get anywhere. There's nowhere to go, and you have no idea what is hiding where you can't see it. So very, very old symbol, spiritual symbol or evolutionary symbol for being a human person. There's a reason why these visuals have stuck around. So if you're living life in a mental cage, like she is, what happens when you wake up and realize that? And you realize then that you're not prepared for the complexity of what the world is. So she's woken up and she's wandered into a very bad part of town. I think that's right off the bat is a really fascinating metaphor for what's going on. I think it's also maybe interesting. She's on her way to cage up her soul in an even bigger cage that would be farther from herself, in a zoo. So like I said, the story is immersed in this sense that there are these other beings, these other things outside of what we're prepared to accept. And if we enter more into the medieval mindset, that gives us stories, and we won't talk right about the reality of whether these things are true or not. We'll just go within the fact that within this story, in the medieval mindset, human beings and these angels, and spirits and bad ones and good ones, we all coexist and we all live together. And this is all very normal up until the last 400 years, till the sort of the Enlightenment, where we lost sight of a lot of this. That's a whole nother maybe discussion. So instead of recognizing that we're porous beings, and that we are filled with and impulsed by and influenced by the spiritual beings in our environment, because we are spiritual as well. The point of this whole story I'm going to offer, the point of this whole story is spiritual reintegration. She is traumatized, meaning she's fractured and fragmented, and she is not a intentional, functional human being at home in herself. She's like parts of a human being. And it takes this adventure for her to be able to reintegrate and come back in a way so that she can get back on track to be her life. She kind of broke apart in the car accident, and it takes this horrible adventure in the wilderness for her to get control of herself and of her own life, start healing her trauma, start paying attention to other people, reintegrate herself, and then of course it ends up with a little bit of the happy ending, which is why I don't exactly see this as a complete horror movie, a horror story. So there's a quote from a YouTube video, I'll drop it in the comments, I thought was a pretty good one. The parrot is a heavenly symbol that calls Mina into the wilderness, and then it guides her out of the wilderness. So, depending on the point of view, a symbol can take on different meanings. So, it can also be like her caged soul. It can be an indication of she's carrying around this view of the world. And it can also be because it's her soul that's trapped. Like your soul is not going to stay trapped forever, it's still going to keep guiding you. Right. So, I thought it was also interesting the idea that the forest itself will stop you from leaving. So this is not just an ordinary forest, or you could even ask, is any forest purely ordinary? So because there's some deep magic that is holding this forest together, holding this containment center, this complex together, this cage to keep these evil beings from getting out, the forest itself is part of this delusion. Now, a question could be is if the magic on it is probably specifically geared for these changelings. Probably humans were never meant to be in this, or humans were supposed to be the ones to understand how to navigate through this. So it just makes me think about what the Buddhists would refer to as the 10,000 things that keep deluding you. And it's so easy to keep getting lost unless you know the way through, which is to be following the enlightened soul, following your higher self, following your spiritual guide, right? The good ones, out of the pre-human chaos of things that need development or need help, or do you just need to stay away from and discern? You don't mess around with them. So okay, so those are some of the symbols that just interested me. Let's talk about our relationship to the world. And this struck me as a sense of how Christianity has engaged with the world, with mythology, with these fairy tales, and how they come down to us today. Now, again, we've lost a lot of this. Let's walk through how the medieval minds that lived more in a world like this, and we can put aside for a second whether or not it's true or not. This is how they saw the world, full of this kind of thing. I mean, you can track this all the way back to the beginning of every, human settlement. This is the kind of world that they believed that we lived in. If you're not careful, you're going to end up being something's lunch, either a saber tooth or a spiritual problem. So there is this very real sense. And I do think that this part is true, and I recognize not everybody does, but okay, well, whatever. There's this sense that when the early Christian missionaries would head out into the wilds and into these places, they were the ones doing this kind of thing, locking things down, being exorcists, clamping down on evil to free up the good. Exorcism brings a basic return of freedom. It gets these spiritual parasites out of you, off your back, out of your community, out of your area. Brings a healing thing. There's a very clear reason why, before a lot of very silly movie making more recently, exorcists are almost always the only things that can resolve problems of possession or, demons and so on. And frankly, they continue to be today. Now, that's a whole nother conversation. If you get it, you get it. But let's just keep going. I think that there were a lot of situations in the past, which is, I'm not going to defend everything. It doesn't make sense to do that, where people were, converted by the sword. But to assume that everything was done that way is a bit, the history doesn't match up to that. And that's just lazy thinking. There are also massive amounts of, part of the history of Europe and of the world where people did choose to convert, and they were very happy to do so. And one of the reasons being was because exorcism works. That's a whole nother question about when you're dealing with the history of humanity. And if you take out the kind of thing that this movie, this story plays around with, if you do take out the reality of evil spiritual beings, not just evil people, but evil spiritual beings, if you deny that that kind of thing exists, then you lose a ton of reasons why a ton of decisions were made. And if you're assuming everything was a power play because we functionally live in a world that has no meaning and it's all about power, which is a ridiculous modern concept of how to, understand human activity and really to understand history, then you have there's so much of what the church gets up to. I'm not saying it's all good, but so much of what the church has gotten up to in the past, or what priests and missionaries and these monastic centers, what they were getting up to in the past, a lot of it just seems completely arbitrary and pointless. But if you restore the kind of thing that people who do have to deal with demonic oppression and who can communicate and do have contact with superior angelic beings and good ones, and there's a reason why there is a lot of anecdotal evidence. There comes a point where you need to start asking ourselves, why are we ignoring the amount of anecdotal evidence that is out there purely because we have a definition of how the world works, and then we ignore a ton of evidence that doesn't fit it. I obviously can't get into defending everything, but there's a reason why this kind of movie is so interesting to us. It's because it forces us to re-engage and rethink with these kinds of things. And when you get it wrong, how dangerous can it be for us, right? So Christianity brings freedom to people from this kind of fell stuff. This actually also gets me thinking about an impulse that people have today to create and safeguard these big national parks and so on, and then fight to leave them alone, to not take care of them at all, to not go in and cultivate and clean them out and bring in the genius and sort of the charism of the good that humans are called to bring, right? So we're called to be stewards of creation, not to dominate it, not to control it, not to make it do whatever we want. We actually are called to live in a specific kind of relationship with creation where, like with our families, where we create these landing zones for souls to be born, and for co-creation to happen, that's supposed to be an environment of love and nurturing. And we're supposed to also have the same kind of relationship with the created world around us, with creation. So the ancient art of forestry and the way that the missionaries and the monastics and the early church fathers and mothers and hermits and so on, what they were doing is they were going out into the wild to hallow the wild, to heal the wild. They're like pioneers and spiritual trailblazers going out ahead of everybody else to heal and to free and to get rid of the evil and to allow the good to thrive, so that not just to promote more human villages and human development, but because the world itself is part of us, and the world itself has its own role to play in, as we would call the apocalypse or the eschaton, the bringing of Christ to all in all, right? So there's an episode on the Nostalgia podcast, and I'll link to that in the show notes, which was all about the ancient art of forestry and how monastic chants, how singing, there's like a mysticism, there's like a magic in singing, and how the monks would get up to this and they would be intentionally trying to heal the earth, right? So that Christ can be all in all. Heal the earth because there are things that are alive and that are active in this world that existed long before we humans entered the story. And pacts and empires were created that are beyond our eyesight because they exist in I don't want to say a spiritual dimension. It's not a right way to put it. They are spiritual. We are also spiritual, but we are, what it means to be a human is to have your focus narrowed down to the five senses and the things that you cultivate in your physical being, so that you can learn sort of the rules, learn the ability of how to be an individual human being. So I'm kind of getting off track here. Okay, so this was the job of priests and of shamans, to keep us oriented in our relationship between the heavens and the earth. And that made me think of the cross symbol, right? There's this moment at the end where Madeline and Mina are fighting, and she starts carving like a Fey symbol on her wrist, and it just made me think like, there's a reason why the cross symbol predates Christianity, because it's an ancient spiritual truth of orientation between the heavens, from like heaven to earth, and then the horizontal relationship that we have between each other, right? So there's it's an orientation of humility and of healing, of orientation towards good, towards centeredness, right? And there's a reason why that was associated with Christianity. Like almost immediately, they recognized this is why this symbol has been for so long intuited in the human condition. It's because this is what Christ, as creator, spiritual being, inherent in us, as an impulse, as a guide, as an influence to us, especially through all of the hierarchies of angels. It is a fundamental truth of how creation is constituted, is the symbol of the cross. It's not just like the thing he was executed on. He was executed on it because it was like a Roman joke to kill somebody on a symbol of life. The idea that heaven and earth and that all things are contained at the center. They intersect, they overlap at the center, and that's where personhood, for example, is found. But that's a whole other thing. Okay, so I wonder if these changelings, if these beings would have remained trapped in their hell within the ground, which almost has a birthing metaphor, I think. They're in like a quarantine or they're a container, right? So they were sealed in, but then they dug themselves back up again and they couldn't get out of the forest, but they could get sort of back up, not into the daylight, but into a nerfed daylight, an attenuated daylight, which would be moonlight. Um, um, I wonder if instead of all of that being abandoned in the forest and it being sealed off, if like there'd been a monastic, like a monastery going in and hallowing that area, what might that have done? What exorcisms might that have created for the changelings themselves? Because we'll get to this. We see something like an exorcism happen to Madeline right at the end with her conversation with Mina. Well, what if these beings, these spiritual beings, hadn't been abandoned, and what if missionaries had gone to plant an exorcistic healing process, like a monastery, that would have brought sacraments and symbols. Instead, what we get is this awful Kilmartin, Dr. Kilmartin, coming out and then inaugurating his observation deck on the blood of multiple batches of innocent beings, right? I mean, seriously, if that's not symbolic, I don't know what is. Well, what if instead you had the blood of another innocent being, right? Christ, who was executed, and then bringing that holy, blood. Now, the part of the difficulty with having that part of this conversation is that we automatically assume that all bloodletting is exactly the same and that's all awful and horrible, as opposed to the mystery of Golgotha, which is what Rudolf Steiner would call it, as a mystery of something, as a gift giving of an opening of the heart of God. No matter what we do, he chooses to love us and to empty himself out completely, even down to the blood and water of his being, as an indication of, it doesn't matter what you do to me, I'm going to love you forever. Right? So what if that kind of mentality, that kind of spiritual background is brought right to this area, and instead we can sort of argue we failed these spiritual beings. We had this war with them, we locked them deep underground, and then we abandoned them, leaving them to seethe and not keeping close to them anything that would have started to help them heal. Now this is what actually gets us into some fun when it comes to not just Christian theology, but sort of pretty generic theology, Christian theology, which is the sense that after evil will never convert. And if we instead take the attitude that no, spirits are always evolving and developing because they're alive, because they partake in that which is life, which means motion and action and growth and change. That is what it means to be alive, especially if you are a person or something approaching personhood. And here's where we start to get into the evolution of spiritual beings, which I'm not totally sure I understand yet. So let's keep going. This story is a great example of something that I'm really interested in, partly because I like to learn about everything, which is when you bury truths of the past and like burn it, like book burning, right? You don't actually preserve yourself and future generations from whatever that problem was. Instead, all you do is you completely forget that it was there, and then it reemerges somewhere else in a slightly different way, and you have not created any sense of a way for someone to prepare for that and to integrate it, to know what to do with it. Great example being that board right at the beginning as she's driving into the forest, and you see all of these people who have like gone into the forest and have never been found again, right? It's everybody, I don't know, whoever is living around the edges of this forest, but all of the locals must know about this situation, and nothing has been done ever to heal this black hole on the land. And this beautiful forest, which is gorgeous, it's this moody, beautiful, brooding forest, it's sort of held captive by this spell that's just keeping these evil things in quarantine, and then nothing ever happens. Like, well, that's not a great way to handle the world. And so, okay, I want to touch a little bit on the idea of, we have, in a lot of the alien UFO literature, we have the Greys who appear, and they're weird, right? They're not only like we see them actually in this. They show up, and the fairies, these watchers, are presented to look like greys right at the end. They emerge kind of as a group soul, with no pallid eyes and no gonads, and it's like, huh, this really looks like greys. This is one reason why a lot of this conversation on around aliens is a bit ridiculous, because we've completely ignored all of the reality of fairies and spirits that all are already here and have continued to engage with us forever. Gigi Young has channel on YouTube, which is really good on a lot of this. She's also big into Rudolf Steiner. And then there's also Graham Hancock's book on Supernatural, which is really dense and involved and goes through a lot of this stuff too. And that's just intriguing. So the Greys, they've also been called the observers, right? They're fascinated with our gift of co-creation. And anybody who knows, that literature of what the Greys get up to, it's like they can't seem to stop themselves. They don't understand what's going on, and that's where there seems to be this metaphor about the video that was present in the coop, right? Was this voyeuristic, what do you call it, Love Island kind of thing, where all these young people are hooking up and all horny together, and it's like even you're watching that, but you're these grays, these watchers are watching humans, but they don't understand maybe how or why, or they're fascinated with the mechanics of co-creation, of birth, of life, of generation, but they don't know what or why, and they want to make it work for themselves, but they can't. And here's where we're slightly getting into the concept of like spiritual evolution. We'll get to that in a second. It's because they are at perhaps a I'm guessing here, lower level of spiritual evolution or spiritual development. They are not where humans are. Um, um, and our relationship to all of this. So let's keep going. So the interesting thing about Madeline is she can't leave her hell, right? She's stuck in this quarantine. She's able to take over the coop and be in the coop, and she's able to guide people into the coop. Like, she is manic about maintaining the rules until somebody shows up who can help her get out of there, because she is the changeling versus being just a straight up watcher. She's like the interbeing between these things, right? She's the bridge between these things. She, I think, has to be the one who put those signs around marking the ring, right? Because there's nobody else before them or before her, and she never answered how long that she's been there. I don't know. I'm guessing maybe Kilmartin put them up actually, but so she can't leave until somebody else of a higher level of spiritual development is able to come in and guide her out. A free soul that is like fully free is the only thing that can escape this forest. And she's stuck within. She is able to leave, but she can't find the way out. And I thought that was just very interesting. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about spiritual evolution, which is something Rudolf Steiner is huge into. And it's such a fascinating topic. I've been trying to study and understand him for the last, I don't know, 3-4 years now, maybe. There's this funny thing that happens. So I don't know what this means or where I stand on it. So it's just interesting to walk around. Animals become more human the more they spend time with us. Like dogs becoming more acute and intelligent with a greater range of expression. As opposed to like wolves, domesticated dogs can communicate a lot more with their faces. You've probably seen these hilarious TikToks of dogs pressing buttons and actually stringing concepts of, words together. Now, I think we get stuck or we get lost in this question of emerging intelligence, assuming that there is intelligence where there can be incredibly sophisticated pattern articulation, which is still not the same thing as intelligence, but that's another conversation. So there may be a possibility here for evolution of souls, but I don't know what that means. And that's a complex thing. So the Christian standpoint is that the soul is created at the moment of birth. Whereas I don't know what it means when you do have specific animals that seem to display an evolution of not consciousness, but awareness of intellection. Then again, like we trained monkeys to like use hand signals to communicate, and then at no point have they ever asked us a question. They'll respond back, but again, what we're getting is sophisticated pattern response, which is not the same thing as intelligence. So this applies now to this story, this idea that Mina's attention and her prompt to more self-awareness to Madeline brings her further in her spiritual journey. She stops being this compulsive, angry, demonic kind of thing to actually getting her wings back, which was a mark of one of the good and beautiful beings. It's like they lost their wings and were confined into the earth, which seems like a rebirthing kind of metaphor. Like you're bad, you're committing yourself to evil doing, so you need to be contained until you can be aware of this. And then turn yourself around and head back towards more reintegration. It's like until you are sick of your evil, you're going to continue being addicted to it. And it's out of that depth that an actual transformation, begins to happen. It happens to a lot of us. So if you've never heard of Findhorn, I've never really heard about them until I read the books of the founders, where they spoke pretty constantly, it would seem, with fairies and with spiritual beings. And they're pretty adamant. Fairies have their own responsibility in the maintenance of the world. Many, it seems, and here's my sense of it, they're not as conscious like we are. So they're pre-human in their levels of development. Some are as attentive as human. They are spiritual beings of the level of conscious intelligence as humans. They have their own track in the world, their own track in creation. They're doing their own thing. You could probably I guess we'd probably straight up call them angels at that point. So it's like you have, mineral things. You have single-celled life creatures. You've got the chain of evolution up to humans. But we miss the fact that below the human level, you're going to have beings of an angelic, angel, or spirit nature, conscious nature, that would be pre-human. So in between, like animals and human, or alongside all of the animals, you're going to have spiritual, semi-conscious beings that have developed alongside animals. And this is what ends up happening when you take entheogens and these different drugs. They shift your own containment focus to how do you say this? Integrate your consciousness into a context that includes a lot of these other beings that are intelligent, that turn and watch you and can interact with you. The problem is that this is probably not, I don't know yet completely. I don't think it's an appropriate thing for humans to be getting up to, because you're supposed to be bringing an insane amount of spiritual discernment into this. And there's a reason why these things are cordoned off from our normal daytime consciousness, something like that. And then above humans, then you do have like fully good integrated spiritual conscious beings that then go like pseudo-Dionysus, I don't know, the hierarchy of heaven. They go all the way up the great chain of being, all the way up to, those beings that are the fullest expression of divinity. In sophiology, that would be Sophia. And then it sort of fractals and it kaleidoscopes in infinity almost of different beings, all the way down, mediating all of that creativity down, to us. And then we're supposed to be mediating that goodness to the world around us, to the things that are below us, in collaboration with the things above us, and so on. So we are where we have evolved, where we are in our spiritual journey, our spiritual evolution, is we have evolved to the point of individual consciousness, of individuation, as opposed to group soul, group think, which is where we were up until the impulse of Christ. And Christ brought a lot of that individuation. Before then, you have a lot of the group think. And that's a whole conversation. There's a far greater participation that we had in each other. This is why where we are in our human journey, with a lot of the things that matter to us now, that sense, the great sense of loneliness, the separation from each other, from the world, our inability to have that sort of clairvoyant, psychic connection to the world that the people in the past all seem to have. We no longer have that anymore, partly because that's what happens. Like when you start growing up, when you go from being a child to an adult, you pull away from all of that. You're supposed to, maybe at some point we will, retrain an ability to reintegrate, to re-participate, to re-engage with that. But now we're able to do it consciously and intentionally, so that you can actually do good with it and not just like be carried along by like whatever impulses you. So So this whole movie makes me think about something Steiner says, where he talks about how evil things and evil angels, demons, how they will end up converting. It's through their engagement with us. It's how they observe us, how they struggle with us. That creates the moments of self-reflection and change for them. Now, he's pretty adamant, and it's pretty smart spiritual science or just practice. Like, you don't seek out this stuff. And there's a reason why exorcists, the popes, priests are like adamant, like, you don't play intentionally, you don't mess around with this stuff, because you're dealing with beings of an order of magnitude that you can't, parasitical beings that you can't control, you can't stop, you can't, it's ridiculous immaturity to be messing around with these things. And so that's why the church offers us things like, the simple things like sacramentals, or even incredibly powerful things like the sacraments. They are not given to us to protect us from evil. That's not their primary function. That's a secondary function, because evil is not the biggest and most real thing in the world. Now, that's kind of the point of a horror movie, is to create that feeling in that sense. This movie doesn't actually do that. This movie actually ends on a more hopeful tone. And I think if we understand that things like sacraments and sacramentals and healthy living, Christian living, what it's trying to do, and even not exclusively Christian, there are a lot of beautiful world traditions that also have these things as well, this understanding of how spiritual evolution, spiritual world works. That you practice these things, you invite these good things because you want to armor up, you want to firm yourself up, you want to orient and strengthen and order yourself so that more good can flow through you, so that more of who Christ is can flow through you, so that you are in a closer relationship with everything good that wants to be communicated to you and through you to others as well. And so the restoration of Madeline's wings at the end. So again, this goes all the way back to the beginning. The symbol of things having wings is of spiritual development, and she gets her wings back. It seems like she has now reached a level of self-awareness, individuation. Her soul comes online, right? It's almost like she has evolved or developed through the help and guidance, the forgiving, merciful engagement with a free soul, which is who Mina has finally become. She's understood, resolved some of her trauma. Her parrot herself is now free, and Madeline is now able to start to become free as well. So I think it seems that maybe an overall metaphor of this whole thing with this parrot is that what happens when your soul is basically a parrot, something that seems like it's intelligent but isn't actually. It can only repeat back to you, like it's an NPC, right? What happens when you stay at the spiritual level of a parrot? You stay in a cage with the cloud of witnesses, this whole spiritual world just sitting there, just watching you, waiting for you to get out of the cage. It's really possible in some spiritual stories or metaphors. The cage is open. The cage is something of our own making, but it takes striving and it takes a willingness to be open to growth, to stop being an NPC and actually become something that is real and that is alive. So the last shot of Madeline is a freed being. Now she's got her red hair. She's got her little bit of a weird face going on. It's like, okay, she's not a saint yet. She's not a bodhisattva. She's not perfect. She's still a pre-human spiritual being moving in the direction, evolving towards spiritual integration. We don't know if she's going to choose good or evil. Maybe they're setting up a sequel. She is still in a process. But one thing we do know, she has been extremely protective of all of them while they were in the coop. Now, it could be because it served her to protect them so that she could get out. But at the same time, there is a real maternal somethingness to her. So now she's outside of her quarantine situation. She's outside of that spell. She's now able to figure out a new dream. So, yeah. Last thought, just my own wondering about this. I'm really curious, like, what was the actual real reason why humans initiated that war? That felt like the only thing in that breakdown. Maybe tell me in the comments. What was the reason for the war to break out in the first place that locked up all of the fairies? Because they didn't seem like they were doing bad things. And it seemed like locking them out, isolating them and quarantining them in the burrows turned them into evil things, stripped them of their things. very likely could be the humans, for some reason, decided that they did not want them around anymore. Maybe they were afraid of the changeling situation. I don't know. I'm pretty sure somebody's going to say, well, the church banished all the fairies and spirit stuff with the witch hunts. And it's like, well, yeah, maybe. But within the context of this story, what is it? What might the reason be? So anyhow, hopefully this was fun. I don't know if this was helpful. It certainly was a rambling walk around topics that came to my mind that, like I said, I didn't see anybody else really getting into. What stood out to you? And if you are not familiar with a bunch of the things that I referenced, like Steiner or Findhorn, maybe this was an interesting little introduction through this movie. Again, stories and myths deal with psychic space, and there's a lot of fascinating symbolism in this story, especially when it comes to wings and spiritual development. It seems to me, when you take out the elements that I'm talking about, this story just stays as a flat fairy tale that, if you're Googling it, which is what I tried to do for like, what's the meaning? Unpack the symbolisms? Like, most people just frankly didn't seem to get it, and they tried to put in themes of colonialism and miscegenation or something like this, which is like, okay, you could read that into the story, but within the context of the story itself, I think I actually kind of unlocked a lot more that's worth talking about that the story seems to be leaning into. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Tell me what interests you if you've seen it. If you've got a movie recommendation, let me know. Subscribe and follow for more rambling, random, interesting, fascinating stuff, the kind of thing I like to get up to. Have an amazing rest of your day. Keep watching movies. Have fun. Cheers.